I had mentioned if you heard about this presentation through LinkedIn, over the past year, I have traditionally been a market and UX researcher, and I've spent the last 20 years in that space. But over the last couple of years, I've been working much more in taking my efforts in the research space to areas that I'm very passionate about. One of those areas being, how do we increase civic engagement with voters? Before I just jumped in and shared the process we used, and I'd love to get your feedback on it, I wanted to tell you a little bit of the story behind why this research came to be and what the motivation and drivers were. So to start, anyone remember November 9th, 2016? It was the day after the election. And all of the newspapers, first, everyone was in a little bit of a glazy situation, wondering what happened the evening before. And news and media was coming up saying, what happened? How did we not predict the results of this election? The forecasts were off, both in the presidential election as well as the senatorial elections. So many polls had been showing that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election by 5 to 7% of the electorate, but that's not what happened. And I remember that morning when I was reading the articles and seeing many articles saying, there was no way we could have predicted this. How could we have known this is what was going to come to be? And at the time, as a qualitative researcher, I thought to myself, yes, there was a way that we could have gained more insight into the voters and what engages them and what will bring them out. And it comes back to the more we can learn in depth the motivations and drivers of people at that in-depth qualitative level, the more we get those insights, it will only augment what we're learning from the polling and predictive models that are sometimes, and unfortunately frequently, missing the mark. So this first started coming up in my mind in 2016 about how do we, as qualitative researchers and also quantitative market researchers, how do we take our skills and put them to good use in other arenas? So this was when I first started thinking about what are the opportunities we have to bring our qualitative insights and research to the work. Now, at the time in 2016, following the election, there was a lot of discussion, and there's been a lot of research since then about what's going awry with the polls and the predictive modeling. A couple of factors that come up time and time again with elections, trying to predict who's going to turn out, who's not, how people are going to vote and why. There's a couple of factors that can lead to misleading results in the polling and the surveys. One factor is non-response bias. What is that? That's when we're talking and polling people, but it may not necessarily be the people who are actually engaged and driven to go out and be engaged and vote. So there could be that non-response bias that the polls are in essence talking to the wrong people. In the case of presidential elections, most recently, there's been a lot of discourse about what might be happening in terms of dishonest responses from people, either people saying that they're going to go out to vote or not, but even more importantly, people being hesitant to give their honest responses in terms of who they're going to vote for. So given these factors, given that there are a few things that could be coming up that polling is not well suited to address, this is where we started thinking about how might qualitative research, in-depth one-on-one research, augment what we're learning. So the rationale behind this pilot that I'll be sharing the details around is that we want to know more and have a full picture view of what voter segments are thinking, what drives them, what motivates them, and just as importantly, in addition to being motivated and driven, engaged, what will activate them to get involved and vote. And we need more of an accurate perspective that goes beyond the polling and the predictive models. The hypothesis from this research was, how can we get there? There's not just one approach, but the hypothesis was that polling is not going away. Predictive modeling isn't going away, as it shouldn't be. But how do we learn even more to augment the existing data we have? And the hypothesis around this pilot study is the way to do that is to start running in-depth qualitative data, not qualitative interviews, not 5 to 10 interviews, in-depth qualitative data at scale. So at the scale and numbers that we can get from the polling to augment what we're learning. So that was the hypothesis going into this. I mentioned when I posted about wanting to share this with my community, which has primarily been the technical community, product UX, is that I see there being a real opportunity, especially in the climate today with the research community, especially UX research and market research, to take the skill sets we have to look for opportunities to help in other arenas. So I mentioned I've been doing research for 20 plus years. The majority of that research has been done at consumer product companies or organizations. But the techniques that we're using to improve product experience, as well as understanding the market and opportunity sizing. All of those techniques that we're using in the tech and product world can be applied to the political arena. I'm very excited. Mary Noon is on this conversation today, and I'll turn things over to her at certain points in the session. Mary was the partner as part of the Hoosier Victory Alliance for this pilot. And when we got introduced a year plus ago, this was the discussion we were having, that in certain areas of our country, while there's polling data and some predictive modeling, there is still a need to get more insight at the state level. So this is where this particular study came to be. It was, how do we pilot on a smaller scale how to augment through the qualitative research? The question I started asking, and this was a question that's been in my mind since late 2016, it was, how can we all use our respective footprints and our skill sets and talents to make a difference? And after an election, it's really hard to know how particular individuals can make that difference. But as I've been thinking about this more and thinking about the research skills and product experience I have, the question I started asking myself is that if I could only do a few select things to boost civic engagement over the next few years, where do I think the best opportunity to start would be? And it's not changing the world overnight, but it's thinking about, how do we incrementally, as individuals, make a change and a difference? And I thought about my skill set. And for those of you who are researchers on the line, I'm sure you could think also a lot about, one of the biggest skill sets I have is to deeply, through my research, understand the drivers, the motivations, and needs of people. So this is where I wanted to start. Was there a way we could start testing out through those skills what might be possible in the civic engagement space? Back to, you can't start everywhere. Where to start for this particular pilot? It was one specific segment where the hypothesis was that there's a large opportunity to learn more about these folks. And the segment we chose, I'm calling it Gen Z. It was a bit more specific than that. If you think about the Gen Z group, it's typically 18 to 24-year-olds. Why were we thinking about this youth voter? There's 41 million people who fit that demographic who are eligible to vote this year. It's a huge audience. There's another component here. If you look at the percentage of turnout of those audiences, it's not huge. It's not small relatively, but it's typically between 25 to 28% of these members of our population come out to vote. So the thought process was, if we want to start learning about a particular segment and how to better engage them, in how to increase and boost their civic engagement, let's start with one segment where there's a huge opportunity to make that boost. So we started with the youth population. And the approach we used, which was iterated over time, it's an approach that we're calling the relational research approach and method. And the idea behind it is, just as I had mentioned, it's integrating in-depth, qualitative, one-on-one interviews into the process so we can learn at a deeper level beyond surveys and polling what's going on in people's lives, what's keeping them up at night, what issues are top of mind. And just as importantly, not just learn this, as I mentioned, from 5 or 10 people, a small scale qualitative study. How do we start understanding these voters qualitatively at scale? Now, why this is the right moment for moving into this space is that one of the big struggles qualitative researchers have had, for historically speaking, is if you're getting thousands of data points from thousands of participants qualitatively, one of the struggles is, how do we at scale with that amount of data quickly analyze and synthesize and summarize those insights? Now, with the advent of generative AI and large language models, another reason there's an excellent opportunity to start integrating relational research and qualitative insight at scale is because, sure, we as humans will still be the drivers of any synthesis of data or summary of data, but with the partnership and being able to work with generative AI models, it allows us to analyze data, large quantities of data, that it just wasn't possible in the past. So there's this period of time now where if we do integrate more of these techniques at scale with Gen AI, we have even more opportunities. So this is the key moment in time where I'm ready to run these types of larger scale qualitative insights, because we have the mechanisms now to be able to analyze at scale as well. So before I show the details of the pilot, I just wanted to share a vision of the future, because we're not here yet. In a lot of my work with product teams, as we're thinking about research studies and where we want to take the product experience, as we learn about users, we always have a long-term vision for where we'd like to get to. So I want to share this vision with you because working with Hoosier Victory Alliance and partnering with them, this first pilot was smaller in scale, but the vision behind the approach we used and the lessons we started learning align with this broader, larger vision for where we can get to. So I'd love you to imagine it's early 2027. It's about 2.5 years from now. And I'd like you to imagine the scenario that hundreds of college students across the country have been trained and have conducted in-depth qualitative interviews, not just with anyone. They've conducted these interviews with their peers, so other college students. So we've recruited hundreds of volunteer college students to interview people they know. And it's a mix and cross-section of these college students they know. It's interviewing independents, Republicans, Democrats, undecided, all of these people. But we recruit a large number of these college students to do this. It's not polling. It's not 5 or 6 questions. It's these college students interview their peers for an in-depth interview, 30 to 45 minutes, to get a sense of what is going on in their peers' lives and what's top of mind and what are their motivations and drivers, just like we would do in product research, discovery research, learning as much about these people as possible. I've said this several times, at scale. If we have hundreds of college students interviewing their peers, if each of these college students is interviewing 5 or 10 people, we have a statistically significant sample just with these interviews. That doesn't typically happen. So we'd be getting hundreds and thousands of interview data responses back. Now, what do we do with that? Once we get that data back, what does this allow us to do? We talk about the difference between quantitative data, survey data, and polling data and qualitative data. The big difference is that polling data and survey data will tell us what's happening. What are the overall general attitudes? How are people thinking at a high level about the issues? What are their priorities? But by getting this in-depth qualitative interview data, we're starting to get insight that we haven't had before around the why. So in addition to knowing the issues of most importance to students, we can delve deeper to be understanding what about their experience has led this to be an issue of great importance. We can understand in their particular individual experience, if they haven't engaged civically, why not? What was their background? How have they been learning about the issues or not? We can also see from these interviews who's turning out for elections and who's not, and what's the difference in terms of their behaviors and attitudes that drove that decision. So it's going to the next level of depth, going from the what to the why. The final part of the vision is when we know the why and we know in-depth information about these people, we then have the ability to work with organizations to get the vote out. So talking about 25 to 28% turnout for Gen Z. What happens if through these insights, augmenting what we're learning from surveys and polling and predictive modeling, we can boost that a little bit? How many more college students in this case that we'll talk about won't skip out on elections? So this is the vision where we'd like to get to in early 2027. So in preparation for the national elections in 2028, we'd have all of this insight to map out interventions to get out the vote to a higher degree than we've had before. So that's the background. Let me share the details of the pilot, and then I'd love in about 10 minutes to open it up if there's any questions so far. I'd really like to make this a discussion so I can learn as well. So the partnership, I showed you the vision for where we get to 2.5 to 3 years from now. We're not there yet. This was the first pilot as part of that vision. It was my organization, Perfetti Media, partnering with a nonprofit, Hoosier Victory Alliance in Indiana, as well as I talked about the college students, as well as Hoosier Victory Alliance established and has strong relationships within Indiana, strong relationships with the College Democrats of Indiana, the student volunteers who we had participated in this pilot were part of the College Democrats of Indiana. When we scale this up in a couple of years, would it be many other student volunteer groups? Of course, College Republicans of Indiana, other states, other youth organizations. For this pilot, we started small to vet the concept. So we partnered with the College Democrats of Indiana for this particular pilot. I mentioned again, this is relational research. So the idea behind this is this doesn't just have to be, I shared with you the vision of college students interviewing college students, but the vision goes beyond that. That why relational research? The idea behind it is that you want to have first, train people on robust interview methods to ensure that when they're interviewing people, they're interviewing them in the right way. But when we train people to interview their peers, what we start seeing, I talked about dishonest responses or non-response bias from polling. By having peer-to-peer interviews, it changes the discourse of the conversation. College students interviewing college students, the level of depth and breadth in terms of the responses, and also these peers already have an element of trust and honesty and ability to communicate with each other. So the hypothesis was the more that we can do this peer-to-peer relational research, the more we can address the drawbacks of polling around the non-response bias and dishonesty. In terms of the rest of the approach, I am a researcher, but in this pilot, I wasn't running all of the interviews. Instead, the goal was training the people to run the interviews with their peers so they could get the open and honest feedback. So that's the approach around this. It's not why we're calling it relational research. In the political arena and political sphere, there's a lot of discussion around relational organizing, relational canvassing, peers to peers getting involved to make a difference in terms of civic engagement. Relational research is very similar. How do we take those peer relationships and learn much more in-depth, open, and honest feedback? There's a lot of research being done in the youth area. One of the organizations, in terms of, we talked about the qualitative research can augment well. One of the organizations that's doing excellent work is Circle out of Tufts University, where again, they're getting such a wealth of information, and the majority of it is polling and survey data. So the goal from the relational research is, how do we learn from the quant what's happening? So from the circles of the worlds and the polls we do, and then get to that next level of depth with the relational research. So the process we used at a high level, very small pilot. For this first pilot, we did not hit statistical significance. That wasn't the goal. The goal of this initial pilot was to see to what degree, if we were to train these college students to interview and have them interview their peers, to what degree would the quality of the feedback that comes back bring us to the next level of depth beyond polling? So that's where we got to. So the approach we used throughout the process was, first, we found the partnership. What organization would partner with us to test out this approach to the relational research? So we worked with the College Democrats of Indiana. Once we worked with liaisons we started with a small group. We worked with 5 universities with the College Democrats groups. And what we did at that point is, within those universities, we recruited college students who were acting as our volunteers. Now, what do we mean by volunteers? They came to a training session, an in-depth training session, to learn how to run interviews and best practices around that. They also came to the training to understand who they should recruit and why, and all of those details. So we had a training session with the college volunteers. And then the college volunteers just went at it. They started recruiting their peers. They recruited a mix of other college students, and they started running these interviews. In the case of this study, they were short interviews. They were 30-minute interviews with their peers. And then we got that data back. The majority of that data was open-ended interview data, and we synthesized it. Now, I mentioned why this is a really intriguing point in time to use this process. Mary knows this well. When we first started talking, when I was talking with Hoosier Victory Alliance about using this model, one of the concerns I had is, if we're getting 1,000, 2,000 data points from 2,000 participants, me as a researcher or a couple of researchers, it's going to take us a while to summarize and synthesize the data. It still does, but I will say, starting to take advantage of some assistance of Gen AI in this process is speeding up the process. We can get into an entire discussion about large language models and generative AI and what it's good for or not for research. That's not the discussion today. But what I'll tell you at a high level is that I'm not using generative AI tools to come up with our recommendations or summarizing all of the data, but it's a wonderful tool and partner when you're doing your initial summarizing of data to speed up that process a bit. That's how I've been using generative AI. So when we do have thousands of data points and participants, it can speed things up. And then finally, we're reporting back the results. In terms of, the results aren't about how do we help this candidate or campaign win, and being very clear about this. The results are around, what are some specific interventions and action steps we can take to get more college students out there to vote. So the universities we worked with, I mentioned we kept it small for this first pilot. We worked with 5 universities. Each of the universities recruited volunteers who would be our interviewers. We also had to make things a bit more orderly. At each organization, we had one rep liaison who was driving the show with the volunteers on their campus. Now, why I'm sharing this is that I already communicated a little bit about the longer term vision. What we saw from this smaller scale study with 5 universities is that the quality of the data that came back was quite good. It was quite excellent. I'd like to say that as a skilled moderator who's been doing this for 20 years, that I would have gotten insights beyond some of these students. I may have, but the responses we got back were fantastic. But what was really exciting about this pilot is thinking about the implications that if we can model these tactics, not just in Indiana at these 5 universities, but partnering with youth organizations across the country to start getting these insights, what happens then? Obviously, like one priority could be looking at colleges and universities and youth groups in battleground states. But it's not just about battleground states for the longer term. It's learning what's happening across the population. So what's exciting is the quality was great with these 5 universities, but the larger vision is how do we do this across multiple states with dozens of universities or hundreds of universities to get that sample size that we're looking for. Traditional, and this won't be any different for those market research or UX researchers, we ran this study in the political arena just like you would run this study in the product arena, where I didn't just have the college student volunteers go out and interview. There was a rigorous process, and we used traditional steps of research planning, qualitative research planning, to get to our end goal. So we put together our study goals with the stakeholders to really identify what topics were of most interest to us. It wasn't just topics about who are these people going to vote for, or what issues are important. It was topics about what is on the mind of these students day to day, what's keeping them up at night. Another really important topic that we wanted to learn more about is where are these youth, where are the college students going? Where do they trust their news or media? Is it news publications? Is it social media? We wanted to delve in there. And then we also wanted to understand what is the process? It's a different experience when you're on campus at college. If you're out of state or in state, like what was the process in terms of how people voted and why? And just as importantly, when people didn't vote, what were the reasons? So we went into depth, we mapped out what the research goals were. This is a lovely little photo of our Zoom with the College Democrats of Indiana. I mentioned the rigorous training we did. Rigorous. It was a 2-hour training with the students where we put together a playbook for them. We shared what we were hoping to learn. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen a little subset of the playbook and table of contents. But it was me teaching these college students how to run discovery research in the same way I teach these courses to product managers and designers and marketing professionals. It was walking them through best practices of running an interview. We also walked through how to recruit their users for the study. And throughout the 2 hours, we were having discussions around here are the key pieces of information we want to learn. And then I walk them through the interview guide I wrote. And again, it's to provide any volunteers who are running the interviews a sense of what data we want to get back. So we provided them the interview questions to ask. What we asked all of the volunteers to do is after they were running the interviews right away, write up their notes, and we put together a mechanism for them to get their open-ended feedback and their quant feedback back to us. The training handbook was pretty detailed, where we went into important characteristics in terms of best practices for interviewing, things like not asking leading questions, keeping the conversation open, hearing from our big priority was not to ask questions like, who are you going to vote for? It was more questions about what is on your mind these days and what challenges are you feeling and what obstacles are you having and what are your concerns? So we could start learning about those types of why insights. We gave them templates for recruiting. So it was in essence just getting them ready to be star researchers. The college students then went off for a couple of weeks. It was only a 2-week period, and each of the college students was instructed to interview 5 of their peers. Ideally, we had a recruitment screener, so we asked them to find a mix of other college students. So a mix of what class they were in the university, a mix of ethnicities, a mix of they may not know the political leanings of their friends or other people in the university, but trying as best as possible to get a mix. And our request was have the interviews be at least 30 minutes and as much as possible cover all of the topics we had in the interview guide. This was very the pilot in terms of getting the feedback back. It was really a simple process. We used SurveyMonkey. So the way this worked is we set up a survey. None of our participants are filling out this survey, but instead, after each interview that the volunteer conducts, they would take the data and notes from the person that they interviewed and then populate everything that they learned from the interview in this survey. And the reason we did this, we had a bunch of volunteers. Each of the volunteers was interviewing 3 to 5 participants, and we wanted to have one central repository that had all of the raw data from the study. Again, what were we testing out? This is a pilot. I was really interested to see to what degree with a 2-hour training session would the quality of the insights coming back feel deep and real, and looking at the quality in terms of the details they got back. And second, we wanted to start learning like how many responses we would get from each volunteer in terms of how many people they interviewed. Each interview, so we got general insights that you could get from any sort of poll and survey, like what class are they in the university. But what you start seeing on the right-hand side was just some of the raw data we're getting back. Questions about in terms of what's keeping them up at night or what challenges there are. We instructed the college students back to, we're trying to move beyond polling and general data to add as much detail as possible as they could about what priorities were important to each of the people that they interviewed. I'm going to stop there. I have more to share in terms of some of the insights and findings we could use. But before I do that, I shared the process in a nutshell. And I'd love if there's any, I know there's just a couple of you on, including Mary, thank you. If there's any questions, or Mary, if you have any comments as well about the approach we were using, I'd appreciate that.
I can start unless there's any questions. I want to make sure we get time for questions, but thank you, Christine. That was really good in-depth survey. It's funny hearing it from my side as we went through it from the different angle when you're in it. I'd like to share some highlights because what I have seen already is the use cases that we're now taking the survey to the next level. To backtrack before I get to that, what I don't think when you're going through it, you see how powerful this was. Because, for example, when we were giving the students coffee cards, we gave them coffee cards, we gave them Amazon gift cards, we encouraged them to have coffee. And those little things really elevated the responses, that relational organizing that Christine was mentioning. The students sat down, encouraged coffee. And we all know when you have a cup of coffee or tea or a drink, it just creates that I want to chat with somebody. And that's why these insights were so much more powerful. In regards to the next level, where I see we're taking this to the next level already, I'm situated close to Notre Dame. The next level of Notre Dame students are stepping up. They want to get involved in campaigns, but they don't know how. So I have a student who actually his parents live down in DC for the State Department and is part of the College Dems here in Indiana. She reached out through the group that we worked with and wants to own TikTok and get college students involved. The first thing I handed her was, hey, these are the issues that we have to dive into. Can you make a plan for it and come back in 2 weeks? She's great. So it allowed us to have a starting point to how to engage with these college students. And the other thing, when we were going over it, the folks who want to get involved, these college students who want to get involved, don't know how. So this really gives them that roadmap for them to take ownership and step into their desire to get involved, but they just don't know how. And then the other thing I'll add from a candidate's perspective, candidates are handed polls all the time. And they're handed polls, but they stand there like with deer in the headlights. What do I do with this? What's next level? With this type of the qualitative versus quantitative, with this qualitative research, they can start seeing the themes and what really matters to their voters. Because we know in this decisive, polarized environment that we are, when we connect on values, we can move voters. And this is exactly what this research shows us. It shows us, which we saw in the college students, that they're more aligned with candidates based on values that they don't even realize. So that was really eye-opening for when you show candidates like, oh, it's from a roadmap strategies perspective. There was a lot of high-level insights in this. So I will pause there to see if there's any questions or anything more that folks want to know about in terms of the value and what we got out of this and the hows.
Hi, this is fantastic, Christine and Mary, and also getting that extra insight into getting students involved or why they'd want to be involved. I came into this just because I'm very curious about the process that you undertook and what can be done. My background, I was just laid off a couple months ago, but was working with a news organization. They have local news properties around the country. So it's very interesting hearing this because it's similar things that I was getting just as we were trying to understand our readers' trust in news, what they're looking for, what they care about. And I like this where you're looking at a very specific group, especially the younger voters who are the ones that are least likely to engage in the traditional ways. And
Mhm.
that was something I was always trying to figure out with our team is these are the people, the audiences we should be looking at and for the future. But
Mhm.
yes, I'm really finding this fascinating, the possibilities for where we could go with this. It's really pretty amazing. And it's a research methodology I had never heard of before, relational research, and something that we actually did struggle with an organization that was biased toward numbers, but yet we really needed the qualitative insights. And so it was this constant tension of we could only interview 5 or 10
Mhm.
people
Yeah. Mhm.
and then not being believed because it's only 5 people. Yes, that's
Absolutely.
Yeah.
really interested to see how you did this and
Yeah,
what
absolutely,
was.
Allison. And Mary and I were having the same discussions coming from the qualitative research end in the product space. I have a quant background too, but my partners in crime in the product space would always be the business analytics and data analytics folks. So we'd have the analytics and then we could complement with the qualitative. But inside a product organization, it was 5, 10, 15 data points. And to your point, people will say, hey, that's not enough. What's really intriguing, and Mary and I had talked a lot about this, I haven't shared it, but we ran a smaller scale study with suburban moms where it was using the traditional model of research, where I was the moderator. I interviewed the moms. I'm a suburban mom. So it was still peer to peer, but it
Mhm.
was me, the moderator, running a typical small scale qualitative study. And Mary and I, Mary, I'll let you speak to it as well. We were just saying, okay, we know qualitative aligns and correlates with the quant, but how would we scale this up where it's a much, much more compelling data set and message? And this came over time. After that first study, we got a lot of great insights from suburban moms, but we wanted to scale up, but not through polling and survey data. So this is what led to the pilot and Mary reaching out to the college Dems to try to get that to that point where it's qualitative insight at scale. And you pointed out a couple of other things, which is really helpful feedback. Mary and I have looked since we ran this pilot. Is anyone running relational research like this or calling it that? They're not, from what we can see. We're continuing to try to see, is someone or are there groups, whether they're part of one of the parties, doing this? And we haven't found them beyond what we've been doing.
And I would add, so I also came to this when Christine and I came together, looking at the gaps in the space of how to get candidates across the finish line, how to get nonprofits better aligned with messaging for civics engagement. And they're constantly, I don't know how many times I'm working with candidates and they're a larger organization comes to them and says, hey, for $8,000 to $10,000, we can do a polling for you. And I'm like, how many people are they going to poll? It is usually around 200, 250 for a district that has over 58,000 to 65,000. Well, that does not help a candidate. I throw it away. I'm like, you can't listen to this. This doesn't give us anything. So that's the gap and challenge we're looking to close. And it can be done when you start looking at it from this perspective. It becomes really rich. I can't tell you how many times I've thrown surveys away that a candidate says, oh, look what they gave me. I'm like, yeah, let's get rid of that.
Right. Yeah,
Right.
that's the other trick is who are you polling? Who's answering the polls? Same thing our organization tried to work with other outside vendors, and you're still going to get a very limited response. So yeah, I love this idea of even recruiting like the college students, or who can you get
Right.
that's going to be interested enough and take the training on board
Yeah.
and to do it so quickly. That's what's really amazing.
Yeah. And I would
And
add
produce
too,
that quality of feedback.
yeah, college students look to us and they want to get involved in campaigns.
Mhm.
And we have talked about this on campaigns and we own this, that when they start in the fall and they really want to get involved, it's hard for us to plug them in because we're moving so fast. So with this kind of data or getting them involved in something that's very focused and they can own it, allows them to get involved, but it gives them ownership and also levels them up and gives them skills. The one student out of this process is now working on the Biden campaign. He's using his research skills in the fundraising field. He was super excited. And that's the kind of stuff that's the other flip of the coin here is we're giving exposure to students to think about their future and give them a skill set while they're involved in college and giving them some real life experiences. That's the other exciting part is giving them an opportunity to, and he's using his skills to try something new.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thinking about news sources and media sources, we didn't delve into the final results, but one of Mary's big questions from a stakeholder standpoint was of these college students, like, where do they go and why to get their news and who do they trust? And that was really enlightening looking at the raw data and analyzing it, the level of depth you can get from the qualitative. It just wasn't here's the news channels, but here's the reasons why. We got the level of depth, and I'm sure you, Allison, had this like in your qualitative research, not just whether they're using TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, but what influencers in that region do they follow? So we're talking about civic engagement, giving organizations strategies now. Who do they connect with and tap into that will resonate the most with this audience? We were getting to that level of granularity, which was really interesting.
And just to add one other thing, the reason why that is so important is who do they engage to, how to get it there is you hear this if I don't know how attuned you are and paying attention to the political world, but in my space, when you have limited resources, a lot of candidates and nonprofits will try to go to the middle. They think they need to go to the middle to persuade the middle to move, and that's actually the wrong way to approach this. You need to get your base on board and have them really understand them because they're the ones that are going to move the folks to the middle. It's peer-to-peer and relational organizing, however you're looking at it in all these different spaces. It's myself who learns about the impact of X, Y, and Z candidate taking away Social Security. And then I'm at a cocktail party and I'm talking about it to somebody else. They go, oh, really? And then they start doing their own research. That's relational organizing. We're just saying, hey, let's better understand this element of it, go in there with that same mindset and be able to expand upon it because that's how you get and you move voters. You don't start with the persuadables, you start with understanding your base.
Yeah, and just also to wrap up where we can get to. So we got a ton of insights for another conversation. Mary, we can talk about actually sharing some of the main insights we got outside of just the process we used. But just it's the getting the college students and the audience engaged. But we talked about it at the beginning. It's also about once we learn these insights are insights, but what's valuable about the insights is how do we activate audiences? And that's where the magic is coming, where when we're getting these insights, the future vision across the board, different states, different audience groups, how do we design interventions to get those audiences out there? And just with this pilot, there's some activities and interventions that are already happening on college campuses in different states, but there were some really evidence-based activation and interventions that came out of this study that it allows us to really think through what are the top 5 solutions or interventions that would most likely boost the college student engagement and tie it back to what we were learning in the research. So that turns out to be really compelling and intriguing as well.